Over the past 11 years,
No, we
Final
don't have
Fantasy XIV has undergone one of, if not the biggest redemption arcs in the history of video gaming.
Like, their
It's fair to
story
say
is
that,
just
given the stature of the
crazy.
company and the expectations that were created based on the success of Final Fantasy XI, when Final
I never
Fantasy
got to
XIV
play
launched
it.
on the 30th of September
need to play that
2010
game.
worldwide, that what greeted fans was pretty dismal. There were glimpses of what the developers had been striving for, and in some respects the game did look gorgeous, but those who had taken part in the beta were left dismayed that almost none of the glaring issues had been addressed when the game launched, such as the map system not showing where party members were in comparison to your own player character, which would
Oh.
lead to an annoying game of Marco Polo, there being
Oh,
no
that's
way to sort your
weird.
inventory,
Isn't
and
that,
let's
like,
not
very
get
easy
started
to
on the
solve?
fatigue system and battle regimen. Over the years, Naoki Yoshida and his task force managed to
The
turn the ship
hero!
around and have now taken things much further, to the point where Final Fantasy XIV is the game that everyone's talking about. Needless to say,
Yeah, for
due to
good
how long
reason.
that's all taken and how methodical the developers have been throughout the process,
Wait,
there
by
are plenty
design?
of stories
Why?
to tell about changes that were made throughout the game's
Why was it intentional that, like, you couldn't find your party members on the map? Why was that by design? Was there ever any explanation?
development and fun elements that have been included, and today we're going to run through some of those stories that are perhaps lesser known, as well as
I will
throwing in some
watch. I
interesting
never got to watch
insights
that
and
video,
lots
but
of
I
little
will.
bonus facts. And in that regard, we're going to be starting
Chocobos!
off with our first fact, which relates to how Square Enix has chosen to distinguish those who weathered the bad times and stuck with the game.
Is that the
even
tattoo
through
story?
Some trying periods.
To incentivize exploration. That's not exploration. That's just trouble.
After the original version of Final Fantasy XIV started to become a more stable product, Square Enix launched a few initiatives to try and entice former players back and reward
Oh,
those
look
who
at
had stuck
Garuda.
with the game throughout everything that had happened. Two of the initiatives were
She
called
looks
the
like a
Legacy
robot.
Campaign and the Welcome Back Campaign, with the latter offering a free trial to players who reactivated their old accounts, and the former offering the Legacy Subscription Package, which would grant players a considerable discount on their monthly subscription
This is
fee
the
for as
actual
long as they
meaningful
continued to
thing
play the
for a
game.
lot of
The
people.
following year, after
That's
the
so
original
cool that
version
they
of
did
Final
that.
Fantasy XIV had been shut down and focus had shifted towards A Realm Reborn, Square Enix further detailed how original players would be looked after. Not only would they be able to access the game without needing to repurchase, but they'd also be able to play it before the official start date.
I mean, technically, why would they repurchase the game that they've already bought? There wasn't any sort of refund, so I don't see the reason why they would do the same thing twice. Hi, Sebastu. Yeah, today we're going there.
And those who had purchased the Collector's Edition would be given a few bonus items, such as the Helm of Light and a baby Behemoth minion, at no extra charge. That wasn't all though. Players who had fulfilled the legacy criteria, irrespective of the version that they had purchased, would gain access to in-game items to help distinguish themselves as veterans. They included the wonderful looking Legacy Chocobo, the option to have their character's name mentioned in the game's credits,
So
and they would
it
also
wasn't.
receive the
You
famed
could
legendary
refuse
mark,
to have
a
your
very
name there?
distinguishable
I
tattoo
mean, why would
that
you?
would be
But
displayed on their character's upper back to help with some flexing. But perhaps due to how visible the mark could be, the developers also included the option to hide it away using a text command if you wanted to just be a bit more incognito.
Lunit, this person's name is just like yours. It's Lunit Darkspear.
Now, sound has been a
Is that
prominent
you?
part of Final Fantasy XIV, and that was the case even before the revival started to take shape. In the initial sense, Nobuo Uematsu acted as the main composer, with Masayoshi Soken serving as the director of the
Oh,
wider
that's
sound
the Final
section
Fantasy
that consisted
XI
of
theme?
10 other people,
I see.
6 sound designers, 2 programmers, 1 project manager, and 1 project assistant. At the game's relaunch as A Realm Reborn, compositional duties had shifted over to Soken, with Uematsu only composing the main theme, and the sound division was increased in size to a team of 12.
That was probably a
By
good
the release of
decision.
Shadowbringers, the team has had significant expansion, with 3 specific arrangers hired to work alongside Soken, 15 sound designers, 2 audio programmers, 4 project managers, and 2 project assistants.
Jesus.
That takes
So
the
many
grand total to
people.
now 26 individuals, a huge
26
increase in comparison to that original team.
That's
The increase is
insane.
understandable due to the sheer scale of the game, but it's also because as the developers wanted to keep upping the standard, some of the sound requests have become very unconventional, such as the request for them to make a sound effect that would depict some pretty vomit.
Wait, I already mentioned figuring out how to depict the transformation of a person into a sin eater was a pretty tricky task. There's one often overlooked element that was particularly challenging. The horror of the shocking transformation is driven home by the sound, but the developers who worked on the scene had to contend with some very unusual direction. The instruction we received regarding the sound was basically pretty vomit, which resulted in a person assigned to applying the sound being understandably confused. Is that how they had to make it sound? Is that why you guys asked me about the sound effects being turned on? I remember the first time we heard it, it was very quiet, and now I'm very sad. If you ever wonder what Pretty Vomit sounds like, now you know. I think I'm gonna have to re-listen to that sound effect because yeah, the problem is you guys asked me about that sound effect, but my sound effects were toned down for some reason, and I didn't quite hear it. But we're gonna have to rehear the Pretty Vomit for sure.
But perhaps one of the more interesting stories came from how the team created the sounds of the gremlin that featured in the opening cinematic of Shadowbringers. Soken revealed in a blog post on the official Square Enix website that he assigned the task of creating the gremlin's voice to a junior member of the team, but after numerous attempts, they just couldn't create something that sounded compelling enough. Soken revealed that as a last-ditch effort, the team member went home over the weekend, took a hand recorder, and went into his closet to discreetly record what he believed a gremlin may sound like, while trying not to disturb the rest of his family.
That's hilarious!
What he came back with sounded much closer to what they needed, and after some sprucing up, it's that recording from the team member's closet that was used in the final version.
I love these spontaneous things that just make stuff that you create 1,000 times better, but you could never tell. Goblin genders are denoted by how their first name ends. Wait, what?
Goblins have featured heavily across the entirety of the Final Fantasy franchise, but it wasn't until Final Fantasy XI that they started to gain a bit more of a starring role. Numerous goblins would be encountered as part of the narrative, but even though some had unique identifiers to help denote their importance to the wider story, it was almost impossible from a visual perspective to understand whether the goblin you were speaking to was either male or female.
We didn't
and
even
that's where the
see what they
naming
looked
conventions
like.
came in. The team working on Final Fantasy XI thought they should create a naming system that would help players to identify a goblin's gender, and it would see the given forename of each goblin have a specific suffix. Ix would be used to signify a male goblin, and Ox would be used to signify a female goblin. When work was underway on Final Fantasy XIV, the role of goblins was carried over from Final Fantasy XI, with them featuring near identical appearances, speech patterns,
We
and
went
of
through
course
the whole
naming
of
conventions.
Alexander.
So
and
if
I
you've
didn't
ever
know
wondered
that.
about the gender of the goblin you're speaking to, such as Mutamix Bubbly Pots, who can be found in Central Thanalan, just take a look at their name and you'll have your answer.
Oh,
Unfortunately, it's not 100% foolproof, as some goblins don't have Ix or Ox at the end of their forename, such as Quick Things All Thoughts, but it should still apply to a decent proportion of the goblins featured in the game.
Okay. So your main event became lore.
One of the coolest parts of the transition between Final Fantasy XIV and A Realm Reborn was how the development team handled the graceful sunset of the original game before they went full on with their preparations for a successor. As this sunsetting loomed, players started to prepare for what became known as the end of an era, and it saw thousands upon thousands of loyal supporters gather near the game's capital cities to mark their presence.
So they knew
as such
the
a
game
pivotal
would
moment
end.
in the game's history.
So they
But something
came
else happened
over
in the
there
weeks
to
prior
say
that
bye.
ended up being so impactful
In a
that the
way,
writers
right?
decided to include references to it within the game's lore. As the calamity loomed, to try and bring about a heightened state, the developers and game masters started to spawn stronger and stronger enemies at
Oh, I
random.
remember in the No Clip documentary how one of the devs said that they were just like sitting there, just like spawning monster and basically just like watching people kill those monsters. That was a lot of fun to do.
Outside the game's cities for players to fend off, as well they thought it would be a rather fitting thing to happen when the end was nigh. In response, players assembled to tackle these dangerous foes, and it led to the creation of the Great Good Boy Wall of Uldar across numerous servers. It would see players summon their Good Boy mounts to form a massive wall around the entrances of Uldar, something that would prevent the larger monsters from entering the city,
That is
and it
so
was an amazing
cool.
sight to see. As a sign of respect, a monument was created in
Yeah,
the Realm
really,
Reborn,
God, yeah.
and at the beginning of the questline that involved searching for the Enterprise, Father Illard made reference to the events that transpired, making them an official part of the game's canon.
Oh,
To
I
further this,
remember
the Rising 2018 seasonal event also had a focus on the Great Good Boy Wall, as players could experience a scripted flashback that relived what happened in the build-up to the Calamity.
I love how they're connected with the community they are to do that.
After taking over from Hiromichi Tanaka and Nobuaki Komoto, Naoki Yoshida worked with Kazutoyo Mahiro and an extensive team of writers to craft a new Eorzea ahead of its relaunch as A Realm Reborn.
But also new characters.
It would still contain some
right?
of the same major city-states, and there would also be a few characters that would reappear, but for the most part, it was a fresh narrative, and that required the creation of an entirely new suite of NPCs, many of which would remain at the forefront of Final Fantasy XIV's story as it was expanded by heavily...
I can't imagine having these characters in the 1.0 and then having to respect their lore and then incorporating them into like the 2.0 for like both the new and the old players to see.
toward Stormblood and Shadowbringers.
It's crazy.
But even though many of these characters have been impactful, with Yoshola even becoming something of a representative for the game, something that has seen her appear in numerous other Final Fantasy properties like Dissidia NT, World of
She's
Final
becoming
Fantasy,
the new
even
Sid.
a manga series called Final Fantasy Lost Stranger, it's another one of the elite supporting cast that Yoshida has the closest bond with. Alphenor Levelier appeared in A Realm Reborn as the grandson of Louis Soir and served as one of the main companions for the Warrior of Light, a role he has continued to play as the storyline has evolved. But beyond that, Yoshida revealed to us when we spoke to him back in 2017 that Alphenor is perhaps his favourite character. The subject came up when we asked about who Yoshida would like to see added to Dissidia NT. Yoshida said he would love to see Nail or Xenos added, with the latter of that pairing actually being added to Dissidia NT in the April 2019 update. Yoshida also shared that if there was a possibility to add another member to Cosmos' side alongside Yosh Tola, he would love to see it be Alphenor, as due to everything that's happened, he often relates to him as he would a brother.
Oh man, am I gonna hear some spoilers? Hopefully not. Almost
Another
no
interesting
canonical
aspect to the
mages.
game's lore relates to how magic is portrayed, as while the Warrior of Light is able to train and master a huge variety of jobs related to magical disciplines, very few other characters exist within the game's lore that either have an affinity with magic or are active practices. This is in direct contrast to Final Fantasy XI, where mages like Shan Toto were plentiful, and it was very much a purposeful
know you,
decision,
but you're
as many of the
cute.
job descriptions even talk about their respective histories and why those who practice the art are so few in number. In
Look
the
at that
case of the
little
Black
one.
and White mages, the lodestone revealed that the arcane arts were known to corrupt the judgment of mortal men, leading them to use their powers for self-gain as opposed to helping those in need. Due to this, only a handful of white mages exist outside of the Warrior of Light. Dark Knights are also few in number, as are astrologians,
see.
and as summoners and scholars were lost to the ages, the Warrior of Light helps to revive those specific disciplines. It's something that has helped to define the Warrior of Light as a special individual within the game's lore, but obviously, as there are millions of Warriors of Light running around, being a mage isn't that unique in the wider scheme of Final Fantasy XIV.
Wow, I didn't know that. That's pretty cool.
And with that interesting lore tidbit, we're going to move on to something a bit more discreet and juicy. That the story of patch 5.25, which was part of
Oh, is this gonna be a spoiler for me? I think you guys might know this better than me. Am I gonna hear something that I'm not supposed to? Okay.
Echoes of a Fallen Star, was based on concepts that were never used for Vagrant Story 2.
Okay, thanks.
During Matsuno's time at Square, and then subsequently Square Enix, he worked on two pretty memorable games, Final Fantasy Tactics and Vagrant Story. Due to the impact they had, sequels were considered for both properties, but Sakaguchi had bigger ideas, and assigned Matsuno to first work on helping to establish Play Online, and then to Final Fantasy XII. Even though sequels for those two original
I don't know
properties
anything
didn't
about these
materialise,
games. I feel so
Matsuno held
dumb.
onto the proposals, and at the start of 2020 began to release small snippets about Vagrant Story 2, and teased that if fans were patient, they might yet see something, and he even hinted that it may be in relation to his collaboration with Yoshida. Yoshida himself has been a long-time admirer of Matsuno, crediting Tactics Ogre as the game
Man,
that
I'm gonna
inspired him
have
to
to
become
sit
a
down
game
and
creator
play these
himself,
games.
with his decision to apply at Square Enix even driven by the potential for him to work alongside Matsuno. That ultimately did not happen, but after a long time, Yoshida was able to realize that desire by collaborating with Matsuno on Return
And
to
this is what
Ivalice,
we're gonna
which is
do when
part of
we
Stormblood.
finish the whole
2
thing.
years later, they would collaborate again for an optional storyline called Save the Queen, which featured in Shadowbringers. And it was this optional storyline that would resurface concepts that were originally planned for Vagrant Story 2. Many months after those cryptic tweets, Matsuno and Yoshida conducted an interview with Japanese publication Famitsu, where the truth was laid bare, as well as part of the reason why those concepts were resurfaced. The story goes that Yoshida gave Matsuno a very tight turnaround time to complete the storyline, and with only a fortnight available, instead of trying to come up with something new from scratch, Matsuno turned to ideas that were previously rejected, and he believed that a story originally planned for Vagrant Story 2 would be just what they were looking
I think
for.
that's useful recycling.
And with that,
well,
I
not
think we're
really
done.
recycling
They were 7
because
facts about Final Fantasy XIV that we
because
feel
it's
you
never been
probably didn't
used.
know, and as always, we've thrown in a load of little bonus facts along the way for good measure. I'm pretty sure though
That's
there are
pretty
still some
cool.
amongst you who knew them all, but let us know in the comments below which you found to be the most interesting.
Is there anyone here who knew all of this without watching the video? Wow, that was pretty cool.